Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the first event of Bard Graduate Center's new seminar in the art and material culture of Africa and the African diaspora. I'm Meredith Lynn. I'm a faculty member at BGC, and I welcome you on behalf of my co-conveners of this seminar, my BGC colleague, Dr. Catherine Whalen, and our Bard College colleague, Dr. Drew Thompson. I thank them and Laura Minsky, who you just met, Associate Director of Research Programs, for their help in organizing this wonderful event tonight, and the Africana Studies program at Bard College for supporting it as well. And of course, I thank our esteemed guests, Drs. Nicole R. Fleetwood and Mabel O. Wilson, who will be speaking with us tonight about their important projects, which involve time and memory. So before I introduce them, I'd thus like to ask you to join me for a moment to remember those who came before us and to respectfully acknowledge that Bard Graduate Center and the places where many of us are tonight are located in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape, and that New York City is a past, present, and future home for many Indigenous people. This land acknowledgement is meant to honor customary Indigenous protocols for thanking hosts and to call attention to ongoing realities of colonial dispossession. By doing this, we also remember and honor others who came here from their own homelands against their free will, especially members of the African diaspora, and the essential contributions that they and their descendants have also made to this place. So now I have the honor of introducing our guests, Drs. Fleetwood and Wilson. Dr. Nicole Fleetwood is a professor of American Studies and Art History at Rutgers University. She is also a curator, writer, and editor. She has written 3 books and numerous articles in her area of interests, which include, and this is a rather long list, contemporary Black diasporic art and visual culture, photography studies, art and public practice, performance studies, gender and feminist studies, Black cultural history, creative nonfiction, poverty studies, and prison abolition and carceral studies. Dr. Fleetwood's curatorial work has focused on art and mass incarceration, and she's curated the exhibition that's now on view at MoMA PS1, titled Marking Time, Art in the Era of Mass Incarceration. This, of course, is also the subject of her talk tonight, and the title of her most recent book, which was published last year by Harvard University Press, and has just been awarded the National Book Critics Circle Award. So congratulations, Dr. Fleetwood. And that gives us even more reason to be excited about hearing you speak tonight about this important project. Our second esteemed guest is Dr. Mabel O. Wilson, who is the Nancy and George E. Rupp Professor of Architecture and a Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. She also serves as the Director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia. Dr. Wilson is also a prolific writer and an architect with wide-ranging interests. She is the co-founder of the architectural practice Studio and her designs have been celebrated at a number of important museums and exhibitions. She has many publications, including 2 books and many articles about her research, which investigates space, politics and cultural memory in Black America, race and modern architecture, new technologies and the social production of space, and visual culture in contemporary art, media, and film. Dr. Wilson is a member of the architectural team that recently completed the memorial to enslaved African-American laborers at the University of Virginia, which she will be speaking to us about tonight in her talk about the commemoration of painful histories, titled, Can We Forget? A Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. And in case you don't already know, Dr. Wilson is a co-curator of an exhibition that just opened at MoMA titled Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. So I encourage everyone, if you can, to go to MoMA and MoMA PS1 to see both Dr. Wilson's and Dr. Fleetwood's exhibitions. So again, I thank you all for coming tonight. And I turn the microphone over to Dr. Fleetwood and Dr. Wilson to tell us more about their important work.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Lynn, for that introduction. Meredith, please call me by my first name as well. Also, thanks to Laura, Drew, Catherine, and everyone else who invited Mabel and me to do this. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Mabel. I'm a huge fan of her work. And this is our first time, I think, ever being able to formally present together. So this is really a great opportunity. So I also want to acknowledge that I am here in Puerto Rico on unsettled land, and I'm sitting next to the Atlantic Ocean, and I'm thinking about the toll of Atlantic slavery, of chattel slavery, of all the bodies buried in this ocean, as we talk about memory and time. I have slides, and I'll be speaking to slides, and just for those of you in the audience, I will be doing visual cues to move the slides forward. So next. So the project that I've been involved in for the past decade is called Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, as Meredith mentioned. And I just want to talk to you a bit about the process of working on this project, how it started, and where it continues to move. It's an ongoing project that includes a book that was published by Harvard in 2020, as well as an exhibition that's currently on view at PS1, and that closes this Monday, April 5th. It's been up since September 17th of 2020. And the project really started with it very, very quietly, actually. And it started with my own struggle to face up to the visual archive that I was collecting over a couple of decades of incarcerated loved ones during visits to see them in prison. And it was about my own kind of realizing the way that I had internalized the type of shame that carcerality produces and criminalization of Black, especially Black working class people. I grew up in a working class community in Southwest Ohio that had been completely rearranged and fragmented first by extractive capitalism and labor politics around steel mills and manufacturing sectors in the 70s and 80s, and seeing how the closing of whole sectors of work had really devastated the community I grew up in, and had left many people working poor, underemployed, and facing multiple forms of economic, social, political, and often intimate depression and alienation. When I was a teenager in the late 80s, I became very, very aware of how people in my community were disappearing, and not only disappearing, what felt like a type of aggressive policing maybe it was part of a coming of age story. I don't know if it was the same experience that my mom had of policing. I grew up literally on the same block. My mom grew up in the same house. I come from this large multi-generational Black family that had moved from Alabama and Georgia in the early 1900s, and had settled in a neighborhood called Second Ward, where a lot of my family still lives to this day, though under a very different geography and very different family and economic circumstances than what the mid 20th century and late 20th century had looked like for us. But in the late 80s, I became aware of the police presence in our community. And again, I'm still to this day, it's like a kind of psychic trauma of when I started seeing the police slowing down and following me and following my cousins, and how we knew it was happening, but we didn't often have the language to articulate it. And instead, we internalize it in our body as a, you know, and to this day, when I see a police car, I still sometimes have this like visceral reaction to hide or to run or to somehow disappear. And as I finished high school and went on to college, I was the first person in my family to go to college, in like a multi-generational family. My male cousins especially were being swept up in jails and prisons. And 3 weeks after I graduated from college, I graduated from college, Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, 30 minutes away from where I grew up. And 3 weeks later, I was in a courtroom watching my cousin Alan be sentenced to life at the age of 18. And one of the things when I was working on marking time, I just remembered the kind of strength and strategies of my Aunt Sharon and my cousin Cassandra to support Alan over the 21 years that he actually spent in prison from ages 18 to 39. And I'm sharing this with you all for the first time. Every time I do this, talk about this work, it's never the same for me. And it's one reason I don't read a lecture, because for me, every time I talk about this, I want it to be different. I want it to stay fresh for me, my experience of this project. But one thing I haven't shared in public, and I forgot to write in a book, and I don't know how much of it was a kind of intentional forgetting, is that when Alan was sentenced, the entire family was in the courtroom, and we had a very strong sense that the verdict was a really negative verdict. And the judge said that they were making Alan a role model, or making him not a role model, but a example for other people in the community of what not to do or where not to be. And when they said they gave him life, I just started crying like intensely. I just really lost it. And my Aunt Sharon turned to me and told me to stop crying, and told me very firmly to stop crying, that the rest of the family there, and they were all women, had already made a pact and agreement. They were there, and I was away at college, that no matter what the outcome was, that they had to be strong for Alan, and that they had to show no sadness. And in fact, while I was crying, they were all smiling and blowing kisses at him. There was this performance that was happening in the courtroom. And that stayed with me as I started working on marking time. And it really stayed with me, the kind of method that Cassandra and Sharon practiced, including doing a lot of emotional labor and preparation before they would go to these weekly visits to see him, because they never wanted him to see the level of suffering that they were experiencing as he was incarcerated. So I say that because the project for me, it does like it, when I started writing about these photographs, I was trying to really do a kind of emotional mapping of these images as they circulate among loved ones. And, and even sometimes the pride that Alan would have in sending me an image of himself when he was in prison, like for Valentine's Day, he did this like really very beautiful, sentimental portrait that he sent to all the women in the family, and just my reluctance of really looking at those images. So that was actually how this project started for me. And as I went around to universities and cultural institutions and museums talking about this, I gained more strength and more perspective, so that it was no longer just about my family, but it was around this like growing community of people who had been experiencing similar forms of like kind of public shaming for either being in prison or loving someone in prison. Because one thing about criminalization and incarceration is that it not only criminalizes the person and who's in prison, but it criminalizes everyone who loves that person and kind of pathologizes them. And so that really for me is like the kind of emotional stakes that was of the project, but those emotional stakes are also political and relational stakes about how do we, forge relationships of love and commitment and connection, even as the carceral state continues to rip apart, especially Black and Latinx and working poor families. And realizing, thinking about Mabel's incredible work, realizing that, the history of the Black presence in the Americas has been one of being separated from everyone we love, and the constant disruptor of intimacy and love and various forms of kinship. Next. But it was through like working with a set of images of my family, my loved ones, that I started to connect with art organizations and activists and attorneys and formerly incarcerated people and loved ones of imprisoned people, and started to build an archive of the visual culture of contemporary incarceration that I broadly use the language of mass incarceration, though there's all kinds of things I can say about the hyper incarceration of certain targeted populations and the long duration of Black captivity and premature death. Ronnie Goodman's self-portrait here that also memorializes his time in San Quentin making art in the art studio there was one of the very first images that I came to know well. I first saw this in 2013 in a annual report done by the William James Association, as I had started to study nonprofit organizations that work with imprisoned artists. This painting opened up so many doors for me, both theoretically, aesthetically, and also socially. It took me a long time after I saw this image to actually be able to talk with Ronnie Goodman, having learned that he had been released from San Quentin around 2009, but had been unhoused in San Francisco for over a decade. I think I came across the work in 2013, and the first time he and I actually were able to talk was in 2016, because of all the ways that unhoused people are left destabilized and without strong and consistent modes of communicating and engaging certain resources. But when I talked to Ronnie, when I finally talked to him, he was also telling me in really powerful ways that not only was he painting himself in a tradition of artists envisioning themselves at work, but that he was also curating, and he used the word curating. He said that he was representing art on the walls of that space in the way that he wanted to see the work installed and not how it actually was. He was also memorializing a site of captivity and creativity that he hoped to never return to. He said it was a painting that he made once he had received his release date. And then it became this way for me to conceptualize the stakes of art making in punitive captivity. And so it's partly through this painting that I developed the idea of carceral aesthetics as the production of art under the conditions of unfreedom. And I also think about it more capaciously to think about art practices of people who are positioned disparately across the carceral state as art that engages with, about, or against captivity and carcerality. And in that way, I include works by artists like Maria Gaspar, Titus Kaffar, Sable Ely Smith, Dred Scott, and a host of artists who have not been incarcerated, but who have spent many years thinking about surveillance, captivity, and criminalization. Also through this painting, I started to think about the very conditions under which art is made. And I really like to talk about this with art students. I've talked about this with various MFA students who've helped me, who have basically given the language back to me, because I think they think about it, but also under various conditions that do not in any way mirror or equal being held in punitive captivity. But I started to think about how space, matter, and time were the conditions that shape art making in prison. So thinking of penal space as a space like this workshop where Ronnie Goodman was making work next. But I was also thinking about penal space as psychic and social space, as the ways in which prisons disrupt one's most intimate relations, one's relationship to self, one's relationship to one's relationship to interiority. What prisons mandate is that one's primary relationship is to punitive governance. And I became really obsessed with how art made in prison refutes that mandate. So you look at this work by Tamika Cole, she made it during 26 years in prison in Alabama. It's called Locked in a Dark Calm. And she describes the making of this work as an act of survival, as a mode of protection. She looks back at it now and realizes that in fact it's a self-portrait, even though she was not using her likeness in this work, but it was responding to some abuses that she was experiencing by prison guards. And she said that art was really the only kind of sanctioned space for her to go to express what was happening without being receiving a harsher sentence or being punished for complaining. So in that way, penal space is both the built environment, but it is also about psychic and social relationships structured through carcerality. Next. And then another concept that comes out of, again, me really meditating on that Ronnie Goodman's work is the limited access to art supplies, and how that limitation is in fact not a limitation, but it's the space for some of the most radical aesthetic experiments that I've been exposed to as a student of art. It is through scarcity and deprivation that incarcerated people experiment with the very conditions, the very materials of their captivity in the service of art making. So that Gilberto Rivera, who was born a few miles from where I sit in Puerto Rico, and then moved to Brooklyn and became a graph artist, and then was sentenced to prison as a young adult, starts to incorporate his state issue clothing, the clothing that is his visual stigmata that marks him as, quote, inmate, in this work, Institutional Nightmare. He also incorporates the documents that hold him as captive subject. And at the top of this work, you see the warden's signature on one of his prison documents. So in terms of thinking about penal matter next. So a lot of incarcerated artists talk about the joy of working with trash and with the remnants of extractive capitalism. Kenneth Reames, who was on death row in Arkansas for over 25 years, he's still in prison with a large defense team working to have him released. During his time on death row, he would ask other imprisoned people on death row to empty out their trash, and he would use their discarded items to really think about racial capitalism and extractive practices of punishment industries, where incarcerated people are charged exorbitant rates for junk food and other items that people outside of prison can readily get at a convenience store. Next. But penal matter, also, especially inside the experiments that take place, the aesthetic innovations that take place among incarcerated artists, also about conceptually framing prisons as a warehousing of bodies, as bodies that are very much connected to other extractive practices, and as bodies that fuel many economies and employees across this country, hundreds of thousands of people, in ways that we see as related to carcerality and as ways that we are still learning to uncover and to rigorously track. And so this is what James Huff was thinking about during his 27 years in prison with this work. Here, I Am the Economy. Next. And then another condition, so I talk about penal space, penal matter, and then also penal time. And penal time for me was, I think, in some ways, the most, a concept that I feel like still is beyond my grasp fully, because it is existential and also experiential. And what I mean by that is, unless you've been locked away as a punitive captive in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell, it's a type of temporality that you can only imagine and speculate, but you have no embodied knowledge of it. And incarcerated people are constantly thinking about time. Time is all they think about often, in many cases. I shouldn't say all, but a lot of people talk to me about their absolute obsession with time and how time tortured them, that being incarcerated, the way that we punish people in this like contemporary society is through measurements of time. And so when you're in prison, when you're sleeping, you're being punished. When you're brushing your teeth, you're being punished. When you're using the toilet, you're being punished. That all of these are increments of punishment. And what a lot of imprisoned people do is they will renegotiate that time and manage it through art practices. So they'll also kind of stretch that time, stretch their own punishment on a scale that is about a long duration of Black captivity. And literally on this triptych, you'll see where Jared Owens has projected the blueprint of Ferreton Prison. I'm thinking about Mabel and some work that Mabel has done on carceral architecture. So here you see the blueprint of Ferreton Federal Prison in New Jersey overlaid on top of the Brooks slave ship. And the Brooks slave ship is an icon that Dr. Cheryl Finley, art historian at AUC in Atlanta, has written so powerfully about in her book, Committed to Memory. She looks at the over 200-year reappropriation, reimagining of this abolitionist image, first appearing in Britain in the late 1700s and then crossing the Atlantic, and also visualized by American abolitionists. And it's an image that recurs in art that's about Black freedom struggles, but also across diasporic situations. And Jared here titles this work Elapsio, Master and Helm. The colors are also highly symbolic, because in the prison where he was incarcerated in New Jersey, orange was a warning color. It was a color that demarcated spaces where imprisoned people could not go. And so this ship prison floats in this foreboding Atlantic water that is orange, as a representation of state violence. Next. Another artist who's thinking about time and embodiment and Black captivity and reproduction is Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, AKA Isis the Savior is her performance name. And she did this amazing 15-minute video about that's a before, during, and after of her imprisonment in Pennsylvania, where she was shackled while giving birth to her son for 43 hours. And she titles this work, Ain't I a Woman, to connect it to, again, not only a long history of Black captivity, but a long history of Black feminist abolition, articulation and leadership, and a reclaiming of a type of kinship that exceeds the mandates of racial capitalism and extraction that white supremacy has placed upon Black women's bodies. Next. So I'm gonna, in interest time, I'll talk for like another 5 minutes, but what I'm gonna do now is just talk about some of the things that I learned through working on this project. I didn't discover, there's nothing, I'm not in, although I like anthropology, I'm not an anthropologist. This is not about me discovering anything. It's about me being a student and learning from people who are experts in survival aesthetics. And one of the things that I learned as a student was the importance of portrait work inside prisons. And it's like a kind of reinvigoration of a type of art form that a lot of people think they know a lot about already, because it's one of the older traditions and now considered a kind of conservative tradition of Western dominant aesthetics. But inside prison, it is portrait making is turned on its head. And it's about the aesthetic discernment, the right to look of people who are being punished and held captive. Not only the right to look, but also the right to represent themselves and to represent others through their gaze. Jesse Crimes's ready-made portraits are one, I think, striking example of how conceptually rigorous this practice can be inside prison, where during his first year, he was in solitary confinement and worked on a portrait series that involved using prison soaps. So these are bars of prison soaps that he's transferred headshots and mug shots onto over the course of his year. Next. And then, like a lot of incarcerated artists, one's carceral biography becomes the very backdrop or the raw material for self-figuration, for self-representation. And so here, Russell Craig on this very large 10-foot by 8-foot backdrop has re-envisioned himself during his time on parole. And the backdrop literally are documents that he collected while on parole after being released from prison, that of penal documents, of foster care documents, of all these kind of carceral indices that kept him tethered to the state. Next. And again, I brought up the quote, Western dominant tradition of portrait making, and many incarcerated artists, they're not refusing that tradition. They're in fact taking that tradition and breathing literally kind of new life, meaning and significance in it. And one such artist is George Anthony Morton, who spent 10 years in prison, and said he used that time as kind of like following a monastic tradition where all he did was study, and he studied, quote, the Western canon, and really excelled at European portrait making, so much so that he was accepted to the Florence Academy during his first year on parole, and ended up winning the best portrait of the year from the Florence Academy in 2016 for this portrait Mars. Next. So I'll just go through quickly the kind of movement, the images I showed you so far, images from the book, and then what it meant to animate the book as an installation at PS1. On the outside of the walls of PS1 in the courtyard area, we reflected on how this public school, that is PS1, formerly public school, now museum, and the architecture of prisons, how they all have these relationships. Some of the formerly incarcerated artists who were on site to help install the exhibition noted that this courtyard literally looks like a prison yard. And what we did was hung to really just pay attention to that significance and the parallels and these institutions of where value and valuation are assigned, that are about collecting and collectors. We wanted to have Ojuri Lutalo's work that was made in solitary confinement on the outside of the building. Next. When you walk inside the building, you see this new work by Sable Ely Smith, who works in neon and does a lot of work about carceral landscapes. And one of the things that Sable and I have vibed about for a long time, we've known each other and collaborated, is what I call Pinot hues, and think about carceral blues and the way, people are now writing about Blue Lives Matter, like Nicholas Mirzoff's thinking about Blue Lives Matter as a kind of an aesthetic of white nativism. And you see Sable invoking this language here in this poetic neon sign called Landscape 5. Next. Next. One of the first rooms you enter is this room that has the portrait series by Mark Latney. That's also the cover of the book. And Mark is a currently incarcerated person in Pennsylvania who does these 20-minute sketches of other incarcerated people. He started to do this project in 2014 and continues to this day, now having amassed about 700 images, portraits. Next. And you see he's continued to do this work during the pandemic, even though he's locked away in solitary confinement, like a lot of imprisoned people during the pandemic, as a management tool, that a very ineffective management tool by prisons to slow or stop the spread of COVID. Next. And just for interest of time, I'm just going to give you a visual sense of how the work looks hung, but I won't talk a lot because I don't want to take up Mabel's time. Next. 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 We're just going to go through kind of quickly. So, and I'm happy to come back to any of these later. Next. Next. So in Q&A, if any of these images strike you as interesting, if you want me to talk more about it, happy to do that. Next. 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 And I want to end one more here with this wall that's dedicated to Ronnie Goodman. I opened up talking about him, and he was one of the first artists whose work I learned about. And I want to end on this slide that we have, that it's one of the last walls you see when you leave the gallery. Ronnie passed away on the streets of San Francisco in August 2020. And it's important for me to end my presentations acknowledging and honoring his vision, his artistry, and his life. So thank you.
Good evening. I just want to start by also saying I'm speaking on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past and current and future Lenape on their homeland. Let me just move some things around. And I just want to say thank you to Drew and Laura for the invitation, Meredith for the introduction, and Catherine for moderating today. And also just a thank you to Nicole, one, for her really remarkable work. The exhibition is really, it's challenging, it's poignant, it's provocative, and this sense of prison as a continuation of the sort of spaces of dehumanization of Black peoples, and the importance of how the show shows the engagement with art making and art practices becomes a means to really resist and refuse those physical and devastating psychic conditions. So I just want to say thank you, Nicole, for all of the amazing work that you do. As a thinker and maker whose work explores spaces of Black life and the manifestations of anti-Black racism in the landscapes that we inhabit, I believe it's important to recognize and also reckon with the legacies of enclosures. And these include exactly what Nicole spoke about, prisons and jails, but also ghettos, favelas, poverty, and even Blackness itself that forms out of acts of violence, deprivation, and predation. And so tonight I want to discuss a memorial that emerged within an institution, a university, whose problematic histories, archives, spaces, and landscapes formed amidst white supremacy and the white nationalism that underwrites the American project. Okay. So the Western episteme and its ontological signifier of whiteness has made it provisional, if not impossible, for Africans, epitomized by captive Africans blackened in the hull of the slave ship, to become Negro, as well as fungible, to attain historical consciousness and thus be modern. In the West, Blackness is consigned to the past and the not modern, signifying the primitive and savage. But nonetheless, Blackness is wholly necessary, as Toni Morrison reminds us, to give definition and depth to whiteness, but only if contained, ghettoized, incarcerated, and pushed toward the horizon of death. That relegation of being on the threshold of modernity, awaiting development, is, as many have written, a misreading of what it means to be modern. Like Toni Morrison, poet Norbesi Philip recognizes the trap of the West's discourses. Philip distrusts the language of documents and policy. She is wary of the language of being and history that can account for the Zong massacre, when in 1781, hundreds of enslaved people were tossed overboard when the slave ship Zong to conserve resources en route to Jamaica. Once returned to London, the slave traders attempted to collect insurance payment for the lost cargo. Those humans turned into property on accounting ledgers and in the court proceedings. Phillips writes of this violence of racial capitalism, the law, and other humans, quote, "The language in which those events took place promulgated the non-being of African peoples, and I distrust its order, which hides disorder, its logic hiding the illogic, and its rationality, which is simultaneously irrational," end quote. What is modern architecture if not dedicated to order, logic, and rationality? But can architecture also be hiding the disorder, illogic, and irrationality that is the double bind of modernity, as seen in the juxtaposition here of liberty and slavery in Jennings' painting during the early years of the Republic? The discourse of architecture, its representational tools, its historiography, its dependency on state power and racial capitalism, its aesthetic and technologies, its landscapes and archives are knotted with this double bind of racialized thinking, representation, and practices. When it opened in 1826, the University of Virginia's 10 pavilions housed faculty and family. Its lawn rooms, which sit in between the pavilions, boarded 125 white male students, and the verdant swath of the terraced lawn in the center was crowned by the rotunda, the centerpiece of this ensemble of the Enlightenment that housed the library. In his plans for this academical village, Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the second governor of Virginia, third president of the US, and plantation owner and owner of 600 enslaved men, women, and children over the course of his life, brought together an exclusive educational community in an environment he designed to be conducive to, quote, health, to study, to manners, morals, and order, end quote. When I was an architecture student at UVA, Jefferson was God. But what was silent in the official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865 was mention of the academical village's dependency on an equal number of, roughly 150 at one time, enslaved men, women, and children. And we see here an enslaved woman taking care of a white child, perhaps of the professors that lived in Pavilion 9. That history hid in plain sight for 155 years. This hidden history became even more tangible to Charlottesville's Black community when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves behind UVA's official cemetery in 2012. 2 years later, in 2014, a ceremony of memorialization that began in the community and ended in the cemetery recognized the lives, their lives, unmarked in order to be forgotten. Students at UVA demanded that the university erect a proper memorial to remember this enslaved community that built and maintained the first half century of the university. So in 2016, I joined with architects Mijin Yoon, seen here on the left, and Eric Howler, activist and conflict mediator, UVA professor Frank Dukes, he's on the right in the blue coat, and Charlottesville landscape architect Greg Bleem to win the commission to design the memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA, which opened this past spring. Seen here at Montpelier with Frank is Brooklyn-based artist Eto Ototigbe, who joined us a year later. And Montpelier, I should say, is the plantation home of James Madison. That's about 30 miles, I think, north of Charlottesville. And then on the left with Mijin was our first effort to start to work on and think about the design of the memorial. And then you could see some of the reference images, the brook ship that Nicole spoke about, and the artwork, and references of Gordon, who the famous image of the scarred back. Over the course of 6 months of the design of the project, we engaged multiple stakeholders in Charlottesville on their turf, going from classrooms at UVA with students and alumni to local community members at the Jefferson School's African American Heritage Center and to local African American churches, as well as to the presidential homes of Jefferson and Monticello and Madison at Montpelier to talk to members of the descendants of those who were enslaved there. And I should preface this with the university had up to that time a very, very contentious relationship with the Black community of Charlottesville, who referred to UVA as the plantation. And this was precisely because of the predatory expansion of the university into Black communities, driving up the cost of rent, also disputes over pay within the university staff. And so it was important for us, I think, also as a team to recognize that the inequalities, the violence of white supremacy continues in the community of Charlottesville and also within the descendant community that was there. So for the 6 months as we engaged with them, we heard that the memorial needed to tell the unvarnished truth about this violent past to have any legitimacy, that it needed to bring the community together in order to learn and reflect on that difficult history, that the memorial needed to express dualities, not only the pain and suffering, but also the resilience, dignity, and humanity of those who were enslaved. And lastly, it needed to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of this commemorative landscape and the fight for justice remains incomplete. It was important for us as a design team to convey the material presence of Black lives at UVA, as one response to our survey shared, quote, "As a Black American, I feel an internal pride of gazing upon every brick, every pillar, every garden at the university, and knowing that this fraught past has birthed an undeniably beautiful present. So we must feel beauty and pride and gratitude." Quote. Along with collecting aspirations and hearing about desired meanings and experiences and the stories that needed to be told by the memorial, we also researched Black traditions and spaces of gathering. As part of the process, we looked for cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into our design. We explored, for example, ring shouts, a low country ecstatic dance whose performers move in a circle and whose rhythms and movements connect to West African practices. Circular forms, the ring shout, a broken shackle, became relevant references for us. We cited the memorial in dialogue with the rotunda, which sits at the highest point of the lawn, which Jefferson placed at a ridgeline of a hill upon which the university grounds were built. The careful terracing of the lawn in section allowed Jefferson to create pavilions that were 2 stories on the lawn side, but 3 stories on the garden side, creating a lower level walkout basement, which housed the spaces for labor and originally rest, sleeping of the enslaved. The spaces behind the pavilion, enclosed by the famous serpentine walls you see here in the little image, were in fact work yards where enslaved labored to chop wood, haul water, wash clothing, and slaughter animals. Jefferson understood slavery to be abhorrent and employed architecture in the architectural section to conceal it. The memorial, in contrast, works to reveal, to open, to invite, utilizing the landscape and the section to create an open bowl-like figure in contrast to the closed sphere of the rotunda. Both are 80 feet in diameter. The memorial is situated on an area known as the triangle of grass, which archaeologists believe to have been an orchard and provision garden that might have been attended by the enslaved community. The memorial is oriented northward in the direction of freedom, and a path to the left lays out a step for each year enslaved peoples lived at UVA, another path toward freedom. The conical intersection creates a series of nested rings fabricated in Virginia mist granite from a nearby quarry. These multiple layers unfold the stories of the enslaved community. The center holds a gathering space, which is inscribed by an inner ring which holds a timeline of historical events. The next layer out creates a concave surface of remembrance, of names, and the convex surface creates a canvas for expression. Artist Eto Otatigbe became interested in layering the information we gleaned from our conversations, from historic sites and archives, such as rare photographs of people enslaved by UVA. The rough-hewn tombstones of the Daughters of Zion African-American burial ground, and the vertical quarry marks in stone that soon would be worked away by skilled masons. We are looking here at a close-up of a photograph of Isabella Gibbons, who is enslaved at UVA. The original image is in the archives of the Boston Public Library because she was enslaved by UVA mathematics professor William Barton Rogers, who would leave UVA for Boston to found MIT. To realize this relief image in granite, the team had to develop a unique process based on Eto's artwork. It's a lenticular process that allows images to appear and disappear, and Eto was using it in his artwork with an image of himself as a hoodie to speak to the hypervisibility and visibility of Black men in relation to policing. So we developed a customized software with our fabricated core of stone in coordination with the design team, our Office of Architect at the university, and our contractor team, Henry, who would meticulously place all of the 57 unique pieces of granite on site. Visible to the public on the exterior of the surface, Isabella Gibbons' eyes that appear and disappear depending on the time of day and your position in relationship to the memorial are symbolic of all those who were enslaved and their descendants who continued to witness the social transformations in the fight against anti-Black racism. To develop the layers of history on the interior arc of the memorial, we worked closely with a group of committed historians whose thoughtful examination of UVA's enslaved community and history of slavery at the university provided rich material. To name names, to tell the story of the enslaved community, required that we engage with an archive of work ledgers and personal letters of slave owners. And as such, it is an archive of daily life, one laced with silences and with violence. Historians estimate that 4,000 men, women, and children built, labored, and lived at UVA from 1817 to 1865, but we know very little about the details of their lives. But all are recognized at the memorial by memory marks, which are arrayed across the inner arc. For most of the 3,111 people to be exact, the archives do not record a first name or a last name. As the spreadsheet on the right shows, found records for 889 persons. Of those references, we know mostly the first names of 577 community members, and for a handful of people like Isabella Gibbons or Sally Cottrell or Henry Martin, we know a first name and last name. But for the remaining 311 recorded persons, as you saw on the ledger, 3 Negroes hired at one point, we used kinship relations and occupations to remember their lives. So as you walk into the memorial, you become enveloped by this genealogical cloud of names, marks, and relationships. The lists of names are traditional features of Western memorials, but given our archive, we had to reimagine social relations and rehumanize the experiences of the enslaved. And as a result, visitors engage Henry, Isabella Gibbons, Jane, Jack, Robert, and Randall as families of sisters, grandmothers, uncles, and friends, as workers who took pride in their work, as woodcutters, janitors, laundresses, and fiddlers. Carved into the granite, the 4,000 memory marks speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us. The community names appear across from a bench with a timeline and water feature that captures the attention of visitors who learn a very different history of the university. And in contrast to the wall of marks and names, which rises and inclines outward, the shallow, near-level water table shares with visitors the history of enslavement at the university. The 70 historical entries inscribed into the water table began with the arrival of enslaved Africans to Virginia in 1619 and ends with the passing of Isabella Gibbons in 1890. The timeline covers the arrival of 10 enslaved laborers to clear the land that would become UVA in 1817 and covers a history of transactions, work, and violence. A steady stream of shallow water washes over the entire arc of the timeline, referencing libation rituals and the currents of the rivers that carry people who escaped toward freedom. As construction began, UVA hired a genealogist, Shelley Murphy, to trace the descendants of the enslaved whose names have been discovered by historians and inscribed upon the wall of the memorial. Pictured here, we see the descendant community visiting the site and many who are local activists and leaders in the descendant community. Isabella Gibbons, a teacher who taught herself to read and write while enslaved, risking her life to do so, who also became a founder of the Freedmen School, which became the Jefferson School. Gibbons is the only member of the enslaved community from which the archives have yielded a full name, a date of death, a photograph, and a brief written record of her experiences. She serves as a witness for her community, and this is what she remembers. Quote, "Can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? We have not forgotten that by those horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or ever will," end quote. Her remembrance of the violence and fear that entrapped her life into perpetual service concludes the historical timeline. Days after the construction fence, just days after the construction fence at the memorial was removed in June, UVA's medical school's White Coats for Black Lives organized a protest. The group took a knee for 8 minutes and 49 seconds in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd, a gruesome reminder that the violences and injustices persist today in the wake of slavery. The memorial's reflective and inscribed surfaces, its paths and gathering spaces, commemorate a Black community who lived lives, who worked, played, wept, died, escaped, resisted, and refused enslavement together. And we remember their suffering, their dignity, and their freedom. It asks, how do communities face the past, reckon with the truths, including the horrible cruelties of slavery, as the Gibbons quote on the timeline described? With Isabella Gibbons as a witness and watcher for her community, the memorial brings together their lives, known and unknown, to ours. Thank you.
Thank you both so much, Mabel and Nicole. That was really wonderful, both of your presentations. And I wondered if, to start us off, if perchance you might have a question or a thought you wanted to share with one another before I invite questions from the audience and the panel.
I'm just decompressing
Yeah,
for a
sorry.
minute.
We should take a Zoom break almost during these things like we do in classes to have a moment to process.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, say, Mabel, you've written about like carceral architecture in the past and thinking about like slave quarters and Black capture, racialized capture.
Mm-hmm.
Mabel?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was thinking about also how you wrote about Stephen Torrentis for Aperture, the Prisonation, the special issue of Aperture, right? And and I'm just I think kind of conceptually, and then also like in putting into practice, how do you wrestle with these histories of architecture, as a kind of as social spaces to structure a type of racial capture, and then thinking about memorializing and what it means to enact maybe an abolitionist architecture. This is just like, I'm just thinking kind of fluidly, openly right now. I don't,
Yeah.
It might be something that
in your presentation, Nicole, you spoke about like the psychic sense of incarceration, the sort of question of time. And I think we're so, I think I always admired that the quote from Walter Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he talks about that architecture could have this like revolutionary possibility, but it exists in this moment of distraction. And that we're not really attentive of the built environment because it's kind of, I always refer to it as sort of background noise. And yet it is so powerful as an agent under the state and under racial capitalism for dividing and then producing like wealth and inequality, right? And the prison is really an offshoot and a kind of logic of that process. And probably about a year and a half ago, through NYU's prison education program, I went with a colleague, Jordan Carver, who was teaching architecture at Wallkill. And it was really interesting because we did a final review. So we looked at student work, and it was interesting to see how people started to recognize their environment. Is the sense of like, well, why is the ceiling so low? Why is the width of like all of a sudden, like the built environment became an agent, an active agent in understanding incarceration and understanding the logics of enclosure. But I think it's a thing that we're sort of almost like tuned off to. And so when I was looking at your exhibition, it was interesting to see how many of the works were dealing with like spaces and, imagined spaces, material of furniture, and, like these things that construct these spaces, that are both physical and psychical.
Thank you.
I have a question that's not very well formed, so please excuse me, but something that struck me in both of your presentations that maybe you could say more about is this sort of the importance of seeing, of being seen, of witnessing. I think that comes across in a lot of the artwork that Nicole showed, and of course the eyes in the monument that Mabel designed, co-designed. So I wonder if you have more to say about the sort of the importance of witnessing, which in the past and also in the present.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about, I write about carceral visuality. So the ways in which carcerality, like the logic of imprisonment and surveillance, how it structures who can be seen and how we see and who's seeing. And Mabel's colleague at Columbia, Saidia Hartman, and has written, about, I mean, one a trap of visibility, and also of this idea of witnessing and the kind of through line we make about witnessing and a type of empathy or kind of ethical engagement. And I think sometimes we make leaps, conceptual leaps, that really don't rigorously think about the detachment that some people still have to the idea of witnessing, or the reproduction of a normalization of violence against certain people through types of witnessing. And I do think, especially at this moment, I think those who have been assigned to the category of white have to find another affective and political and ethical relationship to these types of categories, especially the looking and the discerning, and the privilege of what seems like inactivity, but really is endorsements of continued state violence.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Nicole, because I've been thinking for something else I'm working on about that question of, what does it mean? Like, what is made visible often through, photography, through video, through, and what can we or can't we know, right? In that. And, that was the challenge of working, I think, on this memorial, because the memorial as a Western form of remembering the past necessitates like you figuration, right? You want to see the figure, you want names, you want dates, right? And all of that is exactly what is denied, right? Black bodies. And so, we had this form that and people's expectation of that form to do a certain kind of work, and yet as soon as we go to this archive, it's just, I mean, the day I received the historians had just put together a list that we were trying to make of the timeline, and it was so violent. I mean, it was just rapes and beatings, and I just shut the document, and I had to walk away. Like, what do you do with that? Like, how do you engage that? And so for us, it became, we heard that we needed to rehumanize people, right? Because they had lives. But we also heard, like, we can't deny the violence that produced that condition either. And it was just really challenging to figure out, like, modes of representation in this form that is crying for, right, these registers of knowing. And so, we just tried to find, these kind of subtle ways of bringing presence but also recognizing the need for distance, that, you know, like Isabella, she's there, sometimes she's not there, you know, like we can't, and it's her eyes, it's not her full figure, you know. And so I always refer to her as the witness and the watcher, but she's this very haunting presence, I think, in the memorial.
Yeah, those eyes were really haunting and powerful. And I think a type of holding of others accountable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think witnessing, you know, I think sometimes we forget about accountability, and you know, and people are, yeah, I think sometimes, I mean, it's in some ways we have these incessant, very surface conversations about race and racial trauma, but the rigorous work is, we're so far from really engaging.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
I don't mean we in this conversation on Zoom, but I mean,
yeah.
I think there's a way that like a kind of repetition of a certain language makes people feel like they're doing something,
Yeah.
when it's actually avoiding the harder work around these issues.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like accountability is absolutely necessary, but that is often circumvented because there's just, well, there's an excuse. Well, that's how it was. Or this is da 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 da. You know, like there's always an excuse, so that there can never be an accounting for and a recognizing or a reckoning, like with, you know, what's happening or what has happened. And I think that's a challenge. Yeah.
I see Peter has a question.
Thanks very much. Both wonderful talks. My question is going to be directed at Nicole, and I want to say how moving and also powerful was not just your presentation, but the work of the artist that you showed. And that really takes me to my question. Fernand Braudel, the great French historian, in the preface to an Italian edition of his prison lectures, because he was imprisoned as a prisoner of war during the Second World War for 4.5 years, he wrote that afterwards, when he was released, whenever he encountered a work that was blindingly original, he always asked of its author whether he wrote it in prison. And I want to know how you assess the possibility of, or the existence of, real creativity, real originality coming out of these carceral constraints that produce this work.
I appreciate that question. And I just want to flag, maybe Meredith or someone, that there's something in a Q&A that's directed at Mabel too, if we can have that can be read. There's a question. Thank you. You know, I mean, it's so interesting because, well, Leslie Jameson, the writer Leslie Jameson, also affiliated with Columbia, wrote a really powerful review essay of the exhibition in this month's Atlantic Monthly, where she talked about, you know, both the aesthetic innovation and the kind of awe of some of the work that she stood in front of, right, at the exhibition. Like behind me, you see part of the 15-foot by 40-foot mural by Jesse Crimes that he made over 3 years in prison. It's these are prison bed sheets, 39 prison bed sheets, but never letting go of the will to eradicate the very conditions under which this awe-inspiring work was made. And another way of saying that is, as I was writing the introduction, and you know, and people would say things to me like, "Oh, you're discovering a category." I'm like, I'm not discovering anything. I'm writing about the conditions. I think part of what brings us more into stark relief is the sheer number of people in prison. And so you have just a robust visual culture that's always existed, but given that we have so many people who are tethered to carcerality, then the production is in some ways heightened. But the history of captivity is the history of people envisioning freedom and of creating. I think those two things are in tandem. There's some incredible art that came out of concentration camps during World War II. So I think, it's for us to understand the power and the necessity of art, and art as really like a life surviving practice, but one that I think at the same time is about it kind of envisioning, but is not necessarily aspirational. I mean, it's important for me to end with the fact that Ronnie Goodman was released from prison, but he still died an unhoused person on the streets of San Francisco. And he also died with his art in the collections of MoMA. And I'm pretty sure he didn't know that he had a work of art that had been collected by MoMA. And I know he wasn't remunerated for that. So I do think that that yes, there is a very fraught relationship between the kind of rigor and exploration, both material and psychic exploration, that takes place when people are held in situations of extreme duress that can in some ways activate levels of consciousness and creativity, but there's no way that I would justify that as reasons for anyone suffering. I hope that answers your question. But I do think that there is a type of what happens, and I just start thinking more about sensory experience, because as Mabel was saying, we often do not pay attention to the subtleties of architecture. And I think when people are in prison, it's one of the first times they might really truly feel the power of architecture to define one's very existence. And there is a way that some people will go into a really deep interior space as a way of mitigating the force of that kind of architectural dominance, and tap into kind of creative zones and interior lives as a way of surviving.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I heard Albie Sachs, who was part of the freedom struggle in South Africa, say that, during the struggle, he was often questioned about why he was so interested in art and the work of, like, what does that have to do with our struggle, Albie? And he said, his response was, well, you have to be able to envision what freedom is. Like, that is that art gives you that vehicle, right? To imagine what freedom is in order to fight for it. And I always remember, that comment.
I wanted to go and address a comment to Mabel that Nicole mentioned. And the question is, from the speaker is, I recently visited the memorial to enslaved laborers, and she wanted to know specifically if you could speak more about how the words were selected that were inscribed, and she found something about the dispassionate language particularly moving. So maybe I'm wondering if you could respond to that.
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned, the first document was just so, it really was this laundry list. It just, and these were many times just quotes taken from letters, ledgers, starting to put things in a kind of chronological order. UVA, they believe UVA only owned 2 to 3 people, but rented the majority of people who were doing work. The professors owned people, and the hotel owners owned people. And so you have this very strange transactional landscape of people being rented, but also people being bought and sold. And so that's kind of what you're reading. And, sometimes they have names, most often they don't, and then stories of, students beating enslaved workers, a young girl who was raped by a student. The student was reprimanded and had to apologize, I believe, to the owner, but of course not the girl. I mean, it was just, it was horrific. And so I think the way we kept going through the entries was to figure out a way to show how life was unfolding, but also always that impending threat of violence, the actions of violence, how people survived through their work, how there were people who escaped, just trying to give a sense of what that history would be. I won't say everybody was happy about that. The powers that be thought this would be, the timeline would be like, this is the redemption of Jeffrey. We would talk about all the great things white Virginians were doing to fight against, slave abolition, and we weren't going to do that. And there was a big fight about it that kind of escalated up to the new president, about that timeline. And so it was really, it was actually charged. And I actually wanted to put the Gibbons quote actually on the exterior, like that would be the threshold into the memorial. But the Board of Visitors wanted to say, the Board of Visitors brought you this memorial, and it was the Board of Visitors who was approving all of the rentals and who was being bought or so whatever. And to me, it just seemed inappropriate. I did lose that battle, but I think where Gibbons' quote is as an end of the timeline is actually quite poignant and moving. So, so that history actually was quite contentious, and also I think very unusual, because I don't think that's what people expected.
So Laura has told me that Anna, you have a question.
Hello, thank you both for your amazing presentations. I was a bit overwhelmed and unsure what I would be bringing to the conversation. I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and so I realized when I was listening to your presentation, Dr. Wilson, that our work is two sides of the same coin, maybe. That what I'm trying to do is take material and make it tell a story. And you have so many stories and you're making the material. So that made me feel a little more comfortable talking to you. And so your talk was especially interesting to me because I'm at the University of North Carolina, where we're struggling with our own relationship with the legacy of slavery, how to appropriately remember and come to terms with the history of our institution. So seeing how this has been done on UVA's campus has been really, really meaningful for me. The question that I have is for you, Dr. Fleetwood, and it was sort of touched on by one of the earlier questions. And you mentioned the parallel experience of other people who have been imprisoned and the nature of the art that they produce and how it's related to their survival. I'm wondering, when you talk with the artists that you've been collaborating with, do they express, I mean, their structural analysis of their position is so brilliant and comes through so powerfully in their work. Do they also talk about their work as being part of this, I don't want to use the word tradition, but this form of art that takes place in these spaces? Are they thinking about their work in connection with these other imprisoned artists? Are they thinking about their work in relation to their life outside of the prison? Can you speak a little bit about how they see their work in a larger sphere?
Yeah, that's great. And I think, I mean, one of the things that I would say is that many who are no longer in prison and who are still working artists will say with much bravado that the art school they went through in prison is by far much more rigorous and difficult to pass than any art school outside of prison. And that there are critique circles, and that there are traditions of art making that you have to be mentored into. There's an awareness of that there's a real robust mentoring tradition that takes place. And that often people will turn their quote misfortune or their, condemnation by the state into the very grounds for a deep dive into learning new skill sets. So for example, Gilberto Rivera, I mentioned earlier, who did this institutional nightmare, was constantly being moved around. It's called diesel therapy, where you're put on a bus and you're just taken to another prison and dropped off there. And it's a way that so that you constantly are disoriented, you can never build relationships with people. And every time he was dropped off at a new space, he would learn a new art skill. So that was his way of kind of controlling what the state was trying to do to kind of make his life feel uncontrollable. So he watched the great American Indian movement leader Leonard Peltier using oils, and so he got interested in oil painting. He was sent to a prison in Louisiana where there was a Black woman who worked in a sewing room and taught him how to sew. So he starts doing textile art. So there's that, and then there's a way that, like, somebody named Russell Craig, who did that 10-foot by 8-foot self-portrait on his prison documents. He came out of prison telling about his mentor James Huff, and how James Huff told him, aim to be undeniable. And it's something they still say to each other. We aim to be undeniable. They're both out. They're both in the PS1 show. James is about to have his first solo exhibition at a gallery in Lower Manhattan. And this is the language they use. And there's a moment where you said you're an anthropologist, where I actually visit Russell, who was on parole at the time, and he was employed as a tour guide at the Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. So it's kind of like the novelty, kind of the obscenity of the formerly imprisoned personnel, the tour guide. But he used that kind of experience, and that maybe that form of exploitation to his benefit by giving a tour where he takes people into this chapel inside the prison that is painted in these beautiful mosaics, and said, this imprisoned artist did this in the 50s, and I'm part of this tradition. So he really minimizes the status of inmate and really elevates the status of being an artist who learned to make art under conditions of captivity.
So I believe Joel has a question next.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, first, thank you, Mabel, who I know quite well, and Nicole, who I'm meeting for the first time, for two terrific talks that both mutually sort of reinforce one another. And so I'm going to ask maybe a too complicated question, okay, but it goes something like this. Originally, I had like two questions, one for each panelist. So for Nicole, yours was, first of all, I don't know about other audience members, I was completely unaware of the conditions, the physical conditions within which incarcerated, folks create work. I'm fascinated if there was time to know more about these conditions. For example, do they produce their works in cells? Or are they given workshops or facilities? Is there consistent policies? Do they differ? And and how or why would this be sanctioned by the carceral institution? But my real question was, it seems that incarcerated artists deal with what seems like a contradiction. How do they make work that has the capacity to be critical of the system that oppresses them, while at the same time, depending on the carceral institution, for what I imagine is the permission, the space, time, and materials to make this work, and in conditions which I imagine, while they're being surveilled or perhaps censored. Then, okay, so that's a question. Then I was thinking about, for Mabel, that part of, the success of this extraordinary project is not only the historical research that you and your team did, Mabel, but the level of community engagement. And so I wondered, how did you accomplish this feat of in a certain way, encouraging, forcing the institution to look in the mirror and hold themselves accountable to their racist legacy in a way that wasn't so threatening that it risked shutting down the process? And then it dawned on me, and perhaps I'm wrong, that maybe these two questions might be related to another. So I'm thinking, how can an artist or an architect produce critical work while working within the framework of powerful institutions who might not only find their work threatening, but to whom they are at the same time beholden to make that work in the first place?
It's funny, I was going to ask something similar of Nicole. That was very much similar, because I think the challenge is also not just critical, but racist. Like, I think the educational institutions that we work in, the museums that we work in, all of these contexts are have legacies of institutional racism, and it makes them very difficult to work within. And that's what I mean. You have to kind of calibrate like everything that you do. I would just say, that timeline I showed, we came in in 2016. There had already been 4 years of work, students who'd sat in the president's office demanding the university take into account its history of slavery. There have been a lot of work done prior to us coming. And what was refreshing and unusual was that it was a university. They didn't know what they needed. They didn't have a site. They had no clue what should be made. They didn't. We came in. I think we were picked because we just asked questions, and I think that's what they needed, was someone to ask questions, and of the various stakeholders of this project, and try to bring them together in some kind of process, which was not easy at all. And yeah, I mean, these institutions, they have really difficult histories. I mean, to hear, there was one site that we were going to possibly put the memorial on, where there had been a anatomical theater designed by Jefferson. It's the only building at UVA designed by Jefferson, taken down. And we were hearing the story of Anatomical Lewis, who had to basically clean up the remains, which were often the remains of enslaved people, Black people, free Black people, who had been dug up, right, grave robbed by enslaved people in order to do medical work, right? And it's just, you just feel like, God, you can't even rest without, value being extracted from your corpse. And, I just had to like walk outside, take a moment, and just, breathe, because you sense the perpetual violence and denial of your humanity, that continues to today. I mean, if you saw any of the George Floyd trial today, it's just, this is not over. And so it's in every institution, and it's a lot of work to struggle, I think, within these publishers and faculty meetings, and to engage this work. But it's great to have people who you're in dialogue with and can support what you do, and that you learn from.
Nicole, did you want to respond?
So I would say there's a few things I would say. Is one that I appreciate the question, and that there's such a range of policies. Well, one, art making in prison is so robust that there's actually federal policy. Like I write about this in an introduction. So in no way am I trying to plug my book, but I want to say that it's too much for me to say in a few sentences, and that the book really goes into the contingencies around these things. And so in some ways, in some cases, art is made in very sanctioned ways in workshop spaces like the San Quentin studio, but the majority of art made in prison gets made in people's cells, sometimes with the knowledge of prison guards, often without the knowledge of prison guards. It's the use of items that are considered contraband. It's through bartering and trading, through commissioning. There's a really powerful commission structure where that really will transform how you think about who collects art. The largest collector of prison art are other incarcerated people who are trading, coffee and commissary goods for a portrait of a loved one or a famous person. And so there's so many different ways. There are some prisons that commodify these works and allow imprison people to sell them, and the prison itself takes some of the profits. So there's not one coherent policy. And it also depends on security levels inside prisons and other things.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question. We're a little over time, but if there's a person who has a burning question that they would like to ask, please do. It's a lot to think about. Well, Mabel and Nicole, we really want to thank you so much for your presentations and your thoughtful comments and for being with us tonight. It was a really wonderful experience and also a really moving one. So thank you.